So this figure is showing you the relative composition of the human body, right? The top portion here is showing you the components that are water, and then the rest are solids. Now, a couple things that they're trying to point out here, right? So this is showing you males versus females. And so when you look at this, kind of what jumps out is that males do have a higher percentage of water in their bodies than females do. Now, why is this? So this graph is showing you the water content of a female in percentage, female versus male. So it doesn't matter that they have a different mass, right? Because this is in percentage, that's accounted for. So males have a higher percentage of water. And this graph answers why, right? So basically what ends up happening is that females carry more adipose and males carry more lean muscle. And when you look at it, muscle is something like 75% water, where adipose, right, because lipids and water don't mix, they don't get along, adipose is like 10% water. So by having more lean mass, males carry more water. Who cares? The thing to keep in mind there is that that lean mass holding water does give you a bit of a buffer against things like dehydration. The other place you'll see that is in the elderly. As they start to lose muscle mass, they start to lose that water content, and it's much easier for dehydration to start causing problems. Okay, so the other thing they're pointing out here is where this water is located in the body. So a good chance to review here, remember that ICF is intracellular fluid, right? This is the cytosol, the liquid inside each and every cell. And you'll notice that's over half of the fluids that are in our body. Clinically, we typically consider the ECF to be about 2/3 of, the ICF to be about 2/3 of the fluids in the body, right? Which this graph maybe doesn't quite get us that far, but some of these interstitial fluids that we'll talk about, some of these extracellular fluids that we'll talk about just don't really play in the mix so well. So clinically, you'll often hear people say things like the intracellular fluid is 2/3 of the body's fluids. Now, extracellular fluid is all the fluids outside of the cells, right? This is review. Interstitial fluid then is referring to the fluids that are kind of bathing the cells. Those fluids are extracellular, but if you wanted to be more specific, you would call them interstitial fluid. That differentiates them from other extracellular fluids like plasma, and then notice other. But what surprised me looking at this graph, right, is that the huge majority of this extracellular fluid is just bathing cells, right? Plasma is actually a relatively small portion of this. Other body fluids, this is when they go into this huge long list, right? Where else can we find fluids? I mean, some of these maybe are pretty obvious, things like lymph or cerebral spinal fluid. But then there's also pericardial fluid and pleural fluid and peritoneal fluid and synovial fluid, right? All these different places that we've talked about body fluid. My personal favorite, they even went to the eyeball. They're like, oh yeah, don't forget the aqueous humor, right? It's true, it's extracellular fluid. Okay. Okay, so we know where the fluids are. We've done the same thing here looking at where our different electrolytes are. Now, at first glance, this graph is pretty complicated. And in fact, in this edition of the book, they updated this and made it more complicated, which is why I left this one in here. So notice what we're looking at. On this side, we're looking at cations. Cations have what kind of charge? Positive. Good. And then on this side, we're dealing with our negatively charged anions. So then what they're splitting up here with the colors is who's in the extracellular fluid and who's in the intracellular fluid. So the way to kind of picture this maybe is they're really just showing you a cell and the fluid around it, right? And they're saying, where are these different ions? And so what ends up happening is the major extracellular cation is sodium, while inside of the cell, you would see much higher levels of potassium. Okay, so remember the sodium-potassium pump keeps putting the potassium back in and kicking the sodium out. Like, the cell just needs this, right? I don't have a good explanation really for why this happens, but potassium dominates the interior and sodium the exterior, right? If you want to worry about these, go for it. I'm good if you have those two big ones. Okay, now we also have anions. The major extracellular anion is chloride. And that should be pretty easy if you don't already have that memorized, because it also often goes with sodium. When we look inside of the cell, when we look at the intracellular fluid, then we're looking at phosphate. Okay. Phosphate's fine, you don't have to memorize that chemical formula, it's okay. But phosphate has a negative charge, and the other one really are these proteins, anionic proteins. And so what we're looking for here, right, is to have a balanced positive and negative and a balanced positive and negative on the outside. So the ions themselves may differ, but we do need to hit a point where we're balanced. Now, the thing that keeps the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid separated is, of course, our cell membranes. Okay? So that cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. And actually, sorry, I'm going to change that to say it, which is true, but selectively permeable is more descriptive. Okay, we're at the end of a full year of anatomy. I feel like you've heard this over and over again, but remembering in that cell membrane, in that phospholipid bilayer, it's studded with proteins, and most things need a special protein to go through to cross that barrier. And so this acts as that barrier between the extracellular fluid, the intracellular fluid. But what we're going to see is that the electrolytes get moved, water can follow, water is never actively moved in or out of a cell. Okay, so the regulation of fluid and electrolyte balance then are very much intertwined. So here's a few things to think about before we jump into the meat of this chapter. So I'm calling this the rules, right? When we look at fluid and electrolyte balance, the body always monitors and adjusts extracellular fluid, right? Even though intracellular fluid makes up a larger proportion of our fluids, you don't have little sensors that go into each and every cell and try to report back what's going on, right? We monitor basically plasma and cerebral spinal fluid, and that gives us a feel for what's going on in the whole body. Because every time you have that membrane, right, if there's a little extra of something on one side, it's wanting to equilibrate, right? And so if there's not enough, say you're getting dehydrated, right, and the plasma level drops, we'll look at this, but water actually comes out of the cells to equilibrate. equilibrate this, right, until you drink, and then you refill the plasma and it pushes back into the cells, right? So this is all very much connected, but you're monitoring and adjusting extracellular fluid. We base those adjustments on plasma volume and osmotic concentration, not on the actual amount of something, right? So we're not like, there's only 457 milligrams of sodium in this body. No, we're basically just looking at, is the concentration correct, right? If that sodium level falls, the blood becomes too dilute, right? It's not concentrated enough in sodium, and that's something that a sensor would notice, right? Or this plasma volume, right? It's not like, whoa, she's supposed to have 4.2 liters of fluid. No, it's going, well, wait a second, right? The blood pressure is dropping because of this volume, that makes it sound weird. It's not the actual amount, right? But the effect that that is having. The other thing, if you don't have this yet, water follows salt. Again, we never actively pump water anywhere. We can't do it, right? But we will move ions around in order to get water to follow them, right? And then again, we hit this in the intro, that anytime they're talking about balance, right, gains and losses have to equal each other, right? So if you drink too much water, you need to lose more water, right, in order to be in a balance, in order not to have, say, lots of edema or something like that going on. The players. I'm kind of being silly here. These are the hormones that are going to help us regulate fluid and electrolyte balance, and you should recognize these, right? So antidiuretic hormone, this is released by the posterior pituitary in response to osmoregulators in the hypothalamus, right? Antidiuretic hormone is going to have its effect at the kidney, where it tells us to reabsorb water, right? This is particularly at the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, where we're actually going, ADH will put in more aquaporin proteins, right, channels that allow water to come in. So those osmoregulators in the hypothalamus, if they notice things are getting kind of salty, you're kind of drying out here, we tell the kidney not to let the water go, right, to hold on to that water, right? It also is able to stimulate thirst, right, in order to get you to drink more and fix this problem. Aldosterone is released from where? Adrenal cortex, and it tells us to do what? Reabsorb, you got it, sodium, right? So we're reabsorbing sodium, and this is also at the DCT and the collecting duct in the kidney, right? That final chance to make these adjustments. Now, aldosterone release can also, could be when the adrenal cortex senses directly, right, that the salt levels are wrong, but this also gets released in response to RAS, right? It's that last part of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, right? So correcting those salt levels. And then natriuretic peptides, right? We looked at these, they do the opposite. They basically tell us to get rid of water when things are getting too full, right? So these are the ones, atrial natriuretic peptide, brain natriuretic peptide, released by the heart if the heart is getting overstretched due to a high blood volume, right? These hormones are going to oppose antidiuretic hormone and tell us to start losing water. Oh, look at that. I even gave you a picture of the kidney just as a reminder, right, of where antidiuretic hormone, and I guess this is distal convoluted tubule, where antidiuretic hormone, and I don't have aldosterone on there apparently, but it's in the exact same places.